Hello, this is week 5 of AI, Robots, and Ethics. And this week we will conclude our investigation of machine moral agency. And we're going to do so by reading the first part, or the first chapter, in the book Thinking Otherwise, which is a book I wrote back in 2012. And we are not reading the whole book, obviously. We'll get to other chapters in subsequent class meetings. But for this week, we want to focus on the pages number 15 through 92. So it really is the first substantive chapter after the introduction in the book. And this chapter really is an attempt to bring some critical reflection to the whole concept of moral agency in general and machine moral agency in particular. So we've had a couple of weeks here where we've investigated moral agency. We've looked at why people have thought about moral agency for machines and the various moral mechanisms that are necessary to extend agency to things that are technological tools, or at least in the past been considered limited only to being a technological tool. So a couple of things I want you to focus on during this week's reading. One is I want us to get a really good handle on what is meant by agency and how we have decided the question of agency when it comes to encountering other entities and deciding whether or not they are a moral agent as we ourselves are assumed to be. So when we encounter others, other people, animals, corporations, the environment, whatever, we have to decide whether something is an accountable, responsible agent like we are, so that their actions can be held accountable and they can be either praised or blamed for doing things correctly or incorrectly, or whether we exclude them as being not agents and therefore just a tool of our actions. Remember, the instrumental definition of technology, which we get from our history, tells us that our technologies on their own mean nothing. They're neutral. And as a result, any harm or good that is done with technology is always attributed to the human user. And that's worked for a good 2,000 years, if not more. Now the question of moral agency presses against that instrumental definition and asks us to consider machines that are not just instruments, but interactive co-producers of decisions and actions in the world, where we might be getting to the point where attributing some accountability, some responsibility, some moral agency to a machine might start to make sense. So as we're reading this week's text, I want us to ask about agency, how it is we define agency, how we characterize agency, and what complications there might be when it comes to deciding whether a machine is or is not another moral agent. Another aspect we're going to look at this week is the question of personhood. Now, we normally think about person as being another human person like you and I. But legally speaking and morally speaking, the term person is a philosophical category and has very little to do with biological species identification, whether someone is or is not human. Person is a much broader category, and especially within the legal sphere, is a very specific way of defining the legal and moral standing of another entity. So, for example, within both moral philosophy and in legal practice, you and I are both considered persons. We're responsible for our own actions, and we can harm another person by doing something against their interests. There are, however, borderline cases where we begin to question whether some human person remains a person. So, for example, a human being on life support, where they're considered in a vegetative state because of brain death, is that still a person? And in biomedical research and biomedical ethics, there's a great deal of debate about where personhood ends and where personhood begins. Is a fetus a person? Or is a fetus a not yet fully developed person? Therefore, making abortion, for example, a legal issue, and it can be decided one way or another based on whether or not the fetus is seen as being a person. We also extend the question of personhood, or the status of personhood, to non-human entities. So, for example, right now, as a result of a decision in the Supreme Court system of India, dolphins are considered persons. That is, they have the same rights as you and I, and therefore they can no longer be held in captivity and displayed in dolphin shows and other things like this. A river in New Zealand was just this year declared a person in an effort to protect its interests against globalization and development. And we live in a world where we already confront artificial entities that are persons. The best example is the corporation. In both US and international law, corporations are persons. They are responsible for their actions. They can be harmed as the result of actions that we do, either against them or in favor of them. And as a result, in the US, it's really weird, but we have corporations that have a right to free speech and now a right to religion, just like you and I have. So this question of personhood opens up, on the one hand, an opportunity to extend moral agency to machines, because if personhood is the qualifying criteria for agency, a machine, like a corporation, could be an artificial entity with the status of person. On the other hand, extending personhood to other objects in our world could be complicated. It could make moral decision-making that much more nebulous and ambiguous. And so I want us to get a handle on personhood as a concept, as a philosophical concept, and begin to understand what it means to extend personhood to non-human others, either animals or, in our case, machines, specifically robots and artificial intelligence systems. So that's all I have. Again, I've given you questions that will help guide your reading. Please access those questions before beginning the reading and then go into the text and start to work with the text. And in the process, try to build a response to the questions and record those in your reading log or in your notebook. That's all I have. Have a good week and talk to you again next week. Bye.